Assalamu alaikum Mohtaram Nazreen. Khair Magdam Shah Tuhun Sainis Aizke Sessionus Mazin. Yith kan zan toy pai shu har hafte shes toy setin judnich koshish karan kuin aham mawzus petin. The Queen Southern Chief Mozu Eva, you hunt Asern Sirif Kashir Tami Mahdu Chasa, Magar Kashir Neber Tichasan, the Titan Session and Mazan Agartoi Pai Asu Esh Zaban change Karanta, Kibakin Lukantam Tivat information. Yithe can use Azuk session soon, Emuk use Asar, Emikus impact, Sushan Kashir Tamti Mahdud King, Isilia use As in Zaban Roses, Zad Karo Esas, Angris. तो उर्दू पठन कत करने कोशिश अलबत्ता अगर अस वक्त मिलो युस अमिच कमेंट्री यम सेशन सह करो शाया पत कशिर पठन ते इंशाल्लाह. And to our global audiences, a very warm welcome and hello to you all. Many of you must already be knowing that on Pen Online, we hold live weekly discussions on issues of significance to Kashmir and to Kashmiris. Likewise, today also is a very significant issue. That's why we've changed our language to English so that we are able to reach these, the awareness, the perspectives to as many people as possible. Today, we'll be discussing the recently released movie, Kashmir Files, and the release of this movie has created quite a din and debate amongst many people. There are many people who believe that this is a true depiction of what happened in Kashmir, whereas many others believe that this is an egregious misrepresentation of the reality. And today we'll try to discuss and know these aspects of what's being projected in the movie, how much water do they hold, and what are the likely consequences of those projections. And the guest that we've gathered today to discuss about these things will be introduced by my co-anchor, Urusa. Urusa, over to you.
Assalamu alaikum and a very warm welcome to all our viewers. Thank you very much, Tausif. And as Tausif said, that this session, given the topic that we are discussing, is an exception in the terms of the language that we will be using, which is English for today. And we are very, very thankful to our guests today, our panelists today, which I'll be introducing. And our first guest for today is Sanjay Kak, who's an independent documentary and filmmaker. Our second panelist for today is Angana P. Chatterjee, who's a scholar academic based in the University of California, Berkeley. And our third and last panelist for today is Inder Salim, who's an artist, a poet, and a photographer. Thank you very much to all our panelists who took out the time and joined us for our discussion today. Without wasting any further time, Tausif, could you please ask the first question? You're on mute.
Thank you very much for reminding me. I'll straight away start with the questions because the questions are many and we'll have to try to finish within the given time. Anna, if I may ask the first question to you. When we talk about movies, propaganda happens to be kind of very inherent to the movies, right from the time of the Russian Revolution, when the kind of propaganda movies or documentaries, they were sort of made to invoke this sentiment of Sovietness and all those kind of feelings amongst the people, which may be seen in a positive light, but also in some sinister ways as well. If we come to the current context of South Asia or the Bollywood movies in particular, if you see the kind of propaganda that's propagated in those movies, do you feel that a similar kind of that identity is sort of invoked or reinforced amongst the people that ultimately leads to the consequences of fracturing or widening the gulfs between communities and creating alienation amongst people?
Thank you so much, Tausif, for having me and for your question and for making this panel available to a global audience. I think propaganda assumes intent, and it assumes intent to for certain enactments. So that a film resides then in the popular imaginary, in popular context, and it seeks to produce a certain effect. And I think this film currently that we are reviewing today or discussing today, Kashmir Files, it subdues the political conflict in Kashmir by rearranging the facts on the ground. It condones and contributes, for example, to the weaponization of religion in the colonization of Kashmir and its occupation by the Indian state. I want to go over a few points that perhaps explicates how this film propagandizes certain Hindu nationalist tropes. I think portraiture such as this belittles the legitimate suffering and pain of Kashmiri Pandits actually during the 1990s, and it does not further the need for accountability. The 1990s, as you know, deeply impacted the minority Pandit community, Hindu Pandit population of Kashmir, tens of thousands of whom were displaced at that time. Concomitantly, the film reinforces the fabrication of internal and external enemies and the Hinduization of Kashmiri Pandits. There can be no peace or justice or accountability in Kashmir without addressing the violent role of the state in the protracted conflict that the film misses, or the mass crimes committed by state forces on Muslims in Kashmir that also the film misses, the precise targeting of Kashmiri Muslims with intent, the stigmatization and repression of local movements, and the Valley's call for justice, accountability, and the right to self-determination. The film, to me, appears to be revisionist in the characterization of events, and it reportedly supports the Hindu nationalist BJP's countermanding of what is playing out in Kashmir today. It's already eroded economy autonomy as of August 2019, and later the laws passed by the BJP government to remove legal barriers to permanent residency for non-Kashmiris and to potentially constitute Kashmir's demographic makeup and render Muslims a minority. Through its characterization of the issues, the film participates, I believe, in the erasure of history. It is important to underscore the incalculable atrocities committed in Kashmir against its Muslim population: enforced disappearances, gendered and sexualized violence, displacement, torture, extrajudicial executions, legalization of impunity to state forces personnel, and the burial of civilians in unknown, unmarked, and mass graves that my colleagues and I have investigated and documented. The film repositions Kashmir's militarized governance and reinforces through that process Islamophobia and the racialization of Muslims. The film condones and may be used by Hindu nationalists to provoke bigotry and xenophobia, proliferated already by them across India at a time when human rights defenders, students, civil society leaders, journalists, and others are being criminalized and targeted and charged with seditious intent and action. State support for this film, I just wanted to, this is not a question that was not part of your question, but if you will allow me, I wanted to underscore why state support for this film is problematic and can be dangerous, because I feel it actually contributes to the propaganda. And I think the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party ruling governments, the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party ruling governments' support for the film can actually, it can instigate, it can have an instigative impact reportedly on audiences toward an anti-Muslim mob mentality. Some of the screenings appear to be sort of points of igniting anti-Muslim mentality already and calls for violence against Muslims, both in India and always in Kashmir. The BJP is also problematically using money of taxpayers to promote one film which profits its filmmakers, which is quite contrary to what it should be doing. And the last thing I wanted to underscore is that the BJP's endorsement of the film, which both the Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Home Minister have done in different contexts, further solidifies the grievance that is narrated through the film, which is another piece of its propaganda, sort of the grievance narrative being positioned as history, as the truth of history, which is extremely dangerous. I think my 5 minutes are up and I should stop now. Thank you for having me again.
Thank you very much, Angana. And I think one of the points that came across to me was that there are multiple malicious intents that the film, it assumes what it tries to say to the audience on a greater level. The thing that comes across whether you talked about the delegitimization of the Kashmiri Muslims and their sufferings, or the kind of things that it underscores for the greater minority in Indian mainland as well, not just Muslims in Kashmir particularly, but the minority in India as well. And when we're talking about the impact that this enactment can have on Kashmiris particularly, but also on the minority in India, I think one of the questions that I may then bring, Sanjay, to you, given that you are a filmmaker and then you yourself have made films on subjects, you've made films on Kashmir and on subjects which have been contentious in a lot of ways. I want to ask you that how do you then think that this enactment or the impact of this enactment is on the society? How do movies impact our society?
Thank you all for setting this up. I saw the film yesterday, having waited for a considerable length of time to kind of get some distance from what was going on. And at the outset, I want to say that I don't think that it's a film that you can ignore or laugh off, because it has in it many things that I think deserve to be taken very, very seriously. We all know some of the facts, and the incontrovertible facts are that sometime in 1990, the Kashmiri Pandit minority felt extremely threatened. There were targeted assassinations, there were acts of violence, and while they may have been sporadic, and those acts of violence affected both Muslims and Pandits, obviously the minority felt the fear at a much higher level, and people began leaving the valley in panic. This is incontrovertible. Everything else about it remains shrouded in some confusion. How many people left the valley? When did they leave the valley? How many were killed? Where did they go to? How many people stayed on in the camps? These are all, for some reason, still shrouded in mystery. So even in the last few weeks, we've seen, for example, figures for the number of dead, dead Kashmiri Pandits in 1990, moving from 89 to 400 to what the film says or the filmmaker says, which is 4,000. So I want to point out that the territory of fact actually it remains unexamined, and this has been one of my personal obsessions. That how do we sift the facts? Now, what this film does is that facts are almost nothing for it. What they do is that they pick events and then they rearrange events in a way that the meaning becomes completely altered, and that I think is extremely dangerous, especially when you lay claim to something called the truth. So did a Kashmiri Pandit get killed while hiding in a storage can full of rice? Yes. Was a nurse killed? Where was a woman, cut apart by a sawmill? Yes, but it was not the same woman in all these narratives. And similarly, in setting up a kind of villainous figure, several characters, several incidents are combined, not always truthfully. Now, why this is important is that facts are replaced in this telling by something called the truth. And the truth is unverifiable. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that gradually in the film, what you're told is that the truth has been hidden from us, which may not be very dissimilar to what I was saying to you, that I have always felt that the facts are unclear. But here the truth is unverifiable because everybody is complicit. The police are complicit, so FIRs don't reflect the truth. The media is complicit, so media doesn't report the truth. The bureaucracy is complicit. So ultimately, what it clears the way in creating this, in sweeping clear all the elements through which we might actually scrutinize what happened, to scrutinize experience, those are taken away from us. So you can't anymore verify something. What instead, both in the film and in the larger world that we see in the media, in the way the film is being promoted, what takes its place is something called memory. And memory is the cement that holds the truth together. Facts don't enter into, memory is everything. Now, this is a contentious thing because to question somebody's memory ordinarily would be an act of violence, But we know, everybody on this panel knows, that we, 5 of us, could witness an event and tell the story very differently. And maybe a month from now, each of us would contradict our own readings of the situation. Whereas what I find quite disturbing is that time and again, I find people, and not just the filmmakers, but the wider audience of the film, saying, this is how it was, because I remember it like this. Now, often you want to say, but, this could not have happened to you because, but you can't, right? So I think that this is my fundamental, how should I say, I won't call it a fear, but my fundamental anxiety is that the film sets up events and brushes aside fact, puts in its place something called the truth. And this is a truth that we can't argue with. And as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker, whose stock in trade is not very different, we also make an argument about reality, But it is an argument, right? I offer a reading of the reality and I say to you, this is how I saw it, and argue with me, criticize me. But I find, in my viewing of the film, I found that it's presenting it to people in a way that it makes it impossible to argue with. And then, of course, as Ongan has already referred to, the fact that the film is being relentlessly promoted by both the concessions from the state and from activists on the Hindutva right, in a way that it's going out to a lot of people without the attendant context, without a conversation such as this, where you might be able to say, but hang on, there are other ways of looking at this story, without taking away from the fact that something terrible happened to this microscopic minority, which began in 1990 and carried on through the 90s, until one can argue that only a symbolic kind of fragment of the community still continues to reside in Kashmir. And this includes parts of my own family, for example. So I'll rest it here, and maybe when there's time, we can come back to it.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. There were so many interesting points that you raised, like about the confusion around all this, like it's quite hazy and foggy, and the kind of shrouding of realities and truths, and the multiple truths that are there, the subjectivities. But one thing that's quite striking that you said is that, like, the 5 of us could witness one event, and all 5 of us can have different readings, and they could change over the time. Yeah. And if I may pick up from the same line of thought and come to Inder. Inder, you're an artist. I would like to know from you, do you think that art can be a fulfilling means of conveying realities? Is it capable of conveying the entire truth and the context? What do you think?
Okay.
Sorry, Inder, you're on mute. Yeah, now you are.
There was something wrong with my mic. So anyway, I think, this reality is a very, very loaded term. I love this, this multitude, idea of that, how we really constantly, pouring out into something which is very, intense, and the densities, we don't have this really kind of available techniques or tools to really measure that this is real. It actually always eludes us. So each one of us, I respect each one of us, though even those who are contradicting me or anyone else. Each, as Sanjay has also said, that everybody's memory is valid, and to counter that would be violence. So everybody's testimony is valid, and we have really no means to really to find a faulty testimony. And so everybody says, okay, this is what I have experienced, true or false. So reality is a very, very confusing term, and the arts have really, not actually provided a very easy route for each one of us or for the masses. It actually complicates it more than otherwise, because we don't have really, without arts, we will not be really able to talk about anything. That's how, because the reality without passing through some sort of arts, it's actually impossible to conceive. As on date, I think in the past also, even if we go to the mythologies, wherever we go, we have this interpretation. I love this Agamben thing that since Plato, we always are really working at this. What is idea? And since 2000 years, we're only trying to provide one more idea to understand what's idea, and there is no end to it. And we are really short of ideas here. So this, to think that the arts is really helping us to understand the real, it will actually always complicate things. But that is our destiny, because we will have to pass through the complexities and the multitudes, or the other term is multiplicities. We will have to pass through this. The shortcut will always be for someone who escapes these densities, and someone who really silences the other. Because the moment you try to silence the other, that means that you avoid arts, basically. And arts, as on date, we all know that is a very complex. It oscillates between modernity, folk, classical, and postmodern, and whatnot. So we have this different readings. Derrida's special thing about this study of archives. If it will reveal archive now, it will be actually, we will know what it is all about, but it doesn't. What he talks about in archival fever. So the question is that every time we have to interpret. Even the sacred texts don't actually reveal anything without interpretations. We have to interpret each and every time. That is our destiny. It is frustrating for the people who want some shortcuts, but there is no way out. So the idea of arts, whether it is using or misusing the reality, I was basically working on the question there, which I actually working on it. I was thinking about this, for example. I will skip this note making thing, but just to share some little things. Actually, I have done a series of works on Kashmir. I think my best of work is on Kashmir. But of course, that is of no use for those who really work out on these shortcuts. For example, my first on the first death anniversary of Afzal Guru in Delhi, one of the best performances, which I constantly talk about, how I actually interpret the devil in the Supreme Court's verdict, and simultaneously I talk about the architecture. One of my best works, But if we go in the details of it, what I am talking about, Meena, how people throw pebbles at the devil, and what is the Supreme Court verdict, of course, then nobody's interested in that. But I love this, that's why the reality is very, very complicated when we mix up things, the trying to really, manufacture the ideas, interpretations. So, for example, I was talking about this, for example, my application pending at the Supreme Court, this abrogation of Article 370 is my way of working at arts. It is not, one can say that I'm representing the problems in, no, I'm not at all. When I was reading this Deleuze on cinema, he categorically talks about that arts is not representation. It is resistance. It can be resistance or not, but that's another matter. But definitely not representation. Because the more and more we actually push, let us say, a photograph as work of art, the more and more it will not represent. That's very important thing. That's what the polemics or the complexities of realities in art is not as we will logically want to resolve in one or two sentences. One has to pass through this what you call this really razor edge of it. Otherwise, because it will not leave you outside. Once you are involved in it, it is about you. Who you are. That's actually a very important thing here to think about arts, because of course there are outside observations to understand arts, but finally I think the people who do arts look at things differently. A poet knows actually how the language is actually twisted, and what is this tuning of, what is the inner rhyme in a poem. It won't be visible for someone who is really, who quotes. Politicians actually love to quote poetry, but actually it's not like that. So similarly, the cinema also. for someone who makes the cinema knows actually what are these blocks of time movements, how one frame melts into another frame. These are special areas of language. So arts is not available for these okay, I quickly use or misuse some certain portions of film and then I do something. That's what the mainstream were working on, some particular making some profits here. They're looking how to actually exploit the sentiments of the people and just earn some quick bucks. That's what this film also is roundly doing right now here, besides the propaganda.
I think, Inder,
So,
I think that
okay.
yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that point, Inder. And I think the need that I felt that I need to come in here is because it is a very important thing that we understand and acknowledge at this point, that art isn't essentially a very, it is central to our lives, how we see, how we look at things, and how we understand things, and what then becomes normal for us. But at the same time, it is probably an ignorant way out of how we should understand an event, or how we should look at an event. It would require us to pass through that complex engagement. We need to engage more with the subject that we are trying to view through the lens of art. Because something like this, an event or a part of our history, although it is, like you said, it is art, then becomes a part where it is open to interpretation. But when there are certain things which have happened on the ground, and there are facts which are coming out of narratives, where a narrative would come out of based on somebody's political identity, where I would look at it differently, I would have experienced it differently, and somebody else would have seen it and experienced it differently. So it then becomes very difficult for art to put in those different manifestations of a similar event. And then the viewer becomes even more confused. That just adds to the complexity of the issue, which is already so complex. So the point then becomes that either we critically engage with what is being shown to us on the screen, or we do not take the ignorant way out and do not see art as how we get our lessons in history, or how we understand such events such as these. And taking from the similar line of thinking, I would like to come to you, Angana. Angana, if I may ask you that, we will straight come to Kashmir files, and the question at hand is that anybody who has viewed it, there are essentially two coins to the opinions, that two sides of the coin, the opinion coin. People have two opinions of it. One side thinks that it is the gospel truth. Whatever is being shown is the truth. That is how it happened, and this happened, and that happened. Whatever is being shown on the screen is what happened actually. And then there is the other side of the coin, which includes scholars, academics, many people from the Kashmir Pandit community themselves, who are of the opinion that it is a gross exaggeration of facts. It is an insular depiction. And the depiction is such that it has presented a very sanitized version of what has happened, what happened in the Kashmir of 90s, or what happened in the Kashmir before actually the 90s came into it. So from your understanding, from your viewing, your seeing and your reading of the Kashmir of 90s, how do you look at it? How would you see it? Which is the lens, and which side of the coin would you prefer to look at it from?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a very rich one and would take a long time. I will try to respond to it briefly. I actually think that it is not a sanitized view of events, but rather it is a calculated view of events that throws everything into it. It creates a storyline that renders one event as symbolic or constitutive of the entirety of the event of Kashmir, and puts it out there. And as we've seen in various contexts where Hindu nationalists have popularized the belief of Hindu genocide, for example, with respect to Kashmir, which as a scholar, I would say, did not happen, did not take place. And as Sanjay pointed out, the role of memory, the remembering of history. I think the film is unsanitary in that it sets forth a chaos. It's not sort of engineered points of facts or story fiction as fact that it introduces into our consciousness, but it rather creates, it unleashes a whole narrative that seeks to cause chaos. And it contributes to already the chaos that the Hindu nationalist government has wrought very systematically. And that's the thing with authoritarian regimes. the precision with which chaos is introduced. And I feel the film very much is an interjection in that trope. In terms of what about the 1990s, I think, as I noted in my preliminary remarks, that we need to take into account the history as it took place, not a set of events, not a microcosm of events, but the totality of events. And we need to look at the 1990s and the decades that have gone before and come after, and to look at what sort of the question at hand would be to address the protracted conflict and to seek justice and accountability. I will pause here.
Thank you so very much, Anna. So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. So a calculated move at creating sort of a chaos by giving out depictions that don't actually convey the realities or the truths in totality. Because for understanding events and episodes, understanding them in totality and in the larger context becomes really important. Coming on to this movie, Kashmir Files, Sanjay, if I may ask you, like you yourself are a filmmaker, you've made quite some films on Kashmir. What was your intention of making those films, and what did you achieve through that? And in comparison to that, what do you think is the apparent intention of this movie, and what is it likely to achieve? That will be my first question. And the second is that you said that we can't take this movie lightly. We have to take it very seriously. What are these serious things that we need to look out for in the movie, especially with regard to the distorted facts that are being given or the ideological biases that are like inherent in the movie? Yeah, those would be my two questions.
Thanks, Tosi. See, I think that for me, I went back in 2003 to Kashmir after a gap of 14 years. I had been in 89 and then I went back in 2003. So it was a long gap. And quite honestly, I was just trying to understand for myself that what happened here, in these years that I was not around or not traveling back. And I won't say I was not able to travel back. I think that I just kept myself away. So the work that I did was my attempt to share my understanding of what I learned, right? And that was in some abstract way an interrogation of the idea of what is this azadi that people are talking about and how is it constituted. So in this, I was almost unable to bring in this narrative of the Kashmiri Pandit narrative or give it the weight that it perhaps deserved, because I always found it kind of at a distance from the narrative of the larger society. And so after wrestling with this idea for a long time about how to bring that narrative into it, without it was not like, okay, so maybe a 5-minute sequence or a 10-minute sequence or a 20-minute sequence or a 30-minute sequence would somehow do justice to it. And eventually, the film alludes to it rather elliptically through a poem of nostalgia by a Kashmiri Pandit poet and kind of leaves it there. So the film was attacked by people saying, oh, you've ignored the Kashmiri Pandit thing, but that was not what I was trying to say. So to be modest about it, I think that it was my attempt to understand what was going on. It so happened that, and we can't take too much credit for it as the filmmakers, it seemed to capture some elements of the reality of what had transpired both in the past and in the present, and the film took on a resonance and a life of its own. Now, I don't want to compare it to a film like this, because Kashmir File is made with a very different intent. They're not trying to understand what happened. They know how they see it, and now it's a question of how do you put it out there. So they're not afraid of being crude because all they're interested in is that it should be an overwhelming experience, and I have to say that it is an overwhelming experience, because I have never seen an Indian film with the kind of brutality and violence that you see in this film. I just want to, having told you about my own experience as a filmmaker, I wanted to say to you that I actually congratulate Pend Online for having this discussion, because since 2003, one of the things that I've been struck with is that the younger generation, and I count Urusa and Tosif, I count you as that younger generation, have actually not engaged with this Kashmiri Pandit issue. And I don't blame people for not engaging with a community that's not around. But I think it was important to understand it not out of charity or out of, how should I say, sort of sympathy, but because it's a very essential way of understanding what happens with minorities, is a very essential way of understanding who we are. So I just wanted to put this little gripe before you, that people my generation and people between your generation, my generation, do engage with this in conversations. But I would find there's a certain inability or disinterest, which I always found a little bit baffling. Your second question about asking me why I think this film should be taken seriously, because actually what it is positing is something which is beyond the Kashmiri Pandits. And I know that people in the Kashmiri Pandit community may not like to hear this, but to me, the film gives a message that somehow sort of steps on them to make a larger point. And that larger point is that Kashmir is not just an integral part of India, but that the very soul of Kashmir resides, the very soul of India resides in Kashmir. So there is this monologue towards the end of the film, which the central protagonist does, which I found quite a clear ideological pronouncement, because basically what it says is that if India has to regain its glories, then it has to regain Kashmir. And everybody so far has conspired to not allow us to see that and not allow us to regain those glories. So, in a sense, we are back at square one. If we thought that in the last 20 years, all the reading and writing and reflection and commentary on Kashmir that we've all been part of has helped us to nuance the matter, well, here is this absolute sledgehammer of popular culture, hugely aided by the state, hugely aided by the larger ecosystem of the Hindutva right, who are now pushing it out all across wherever they have a sympathetic audience in India, that Kashmir has to be reclaimed for India, not even for just the Kashmiri Pandits. And I think that's quite serious.
That's a very interesting point that you raised, Sanjay. I'm sorry. So I'm compelled to come in with an additional question, a very short in this one, because you talked about the chaos, building up from what Angna also said, the chaos that the Hindutva creates, and this larger imaginary where Kashmir is to be reclaimed, come whatever may come, and any kind of thing that you do within Kashmir to the Kashmiris. I wouldn't get into the element of Kashmiri Muslims and all, but then that becomes sort of a national service, whether it's killing a common Kashmiri or something. Do you feel that Kashmiri Pandits, the kind of videos that have been coming through, do you feel they are sort of falling into this and helping in aiding and abetting and augmenting this larger kind of design of Hindutva?
So, two things. One is, for example, if you read the comments that are coming from the very small Kashmiri Pandit community in Kashmir, they take a very different position. So for example, Sanjay Tikku of the KPSS has come out with a much more nuanced kind of response. There have been some very interesting videos which have come out of people in the camps in Jammu, who are also saying the same thing, that this film is not going to make it easier for us to go back. It's making it worse. So now your question about, are they falling into the trap? Quite honestly, I don't believe that a community with a claim to intellect and reading and scholarship can be represented as hapless victims alone. If they are moving even further towards the right, then I think that we have to understand that they're taking the responsibility for it. They're not. We shouldn't infantilize this thing. I think that many people made that decision in the 90s, and many of those people and many other people are taking that decision now. It is a decision. So my comment about what I had to deal with when I was working on my film, which is that I couldn't understand how to reconcile these two interests, it still stays. When I read something that Sanjay Tikku says, I feel heartened. If I read something where somebody suggests that we have to find a way out of this, I feel heartened. But I feel very depressed when I hear people wanting to claim it for some kind of mythic past. It makes me, it troubles me. I think there's a comment from Ongwana.
Sanjay, very well thought. I think to me, what appears dangerous about the film is that it attempts to, or it says that it speaks for the entire community, the Pandit community. And it discounts then the careful work put out by people such as yourself, by people who are living still in the valley, small community, but living in the valley, such as Sanjay Tikku and others who are attempting perhaps to tell a different story. So it creates a uniform narrative that seeks to speak for the Kashmiri Pandit. And at any time in history when a community is posited as a monolith, it's problematic and portentous of other things to come. I think also it's the context into which the film is released that terrifies me, because you have, with respect to Kashmir, all of the really horrific ways in which the community is being targeted: human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, civil society leaders, all of them repeatedly of Muslim descent. And I think so there's already, and then there's the notion that Kashmir belongs firmly to India. India belongs firmly to Hindus, right? Because it's not just Kashmir belongs to India, it's also India belongs to Hindus. And I think into that narrative that is being popularized, and it's not just a narrative, it's also the actions, whether it is in Assam, in India, whether it is in Assam, whether it is in Uttar Pradesh, all across, there's calculated action in law and politics and society and culture to energize that discourse into action. And then the role of Kashmir, the very, very particular role of Kashmir, always to drum up, I don't like using the term, but for a moment, if one can use it, to drum up hysteria, to drum up a certain kind of overarching fear that something is attacking us, that we can't see it, we don't know where it comes from, but we know it's there. And Kashmir is very central to how we address it, how we get rid of it. And to fully occupying and fully domesticating Kashmir is critical to that. And at this moment, the film is released around a set of sub-elections in India that took place, and we saw, particularly in Uttar Pradesh, a sort of inflammatory, bigoted individual who regained his seat, Yogi Adityanath, for example. All of this is playing out into which the film is released. And it seems to me that there's a calculus, or it will be, I don't know that the film had a calculus when it released itself, I cannot know that, but it seems to me that it can function to create a certain calculated motive as to what it gives permission to people to believe and to act on, and that's dangerous. So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you very much, Angana, and thank you very much, Sanjay. I think one of the important points that does come across is that there are many aspects of how we should look at Kashmir that have been left out. Because as a Kashmiri myself, I think there is always an issue where our narratives are not our narratives. It's always people telling us what we think or how we should think. And it's not just for Kashmiri Muslims. It is similar. The same is the case for Kashmiri Pandits now. That is what Kashmir Files is essentially doing. It is presenting a very calculated image of how you should look at the suffering of the Kashmiri Pandit, how you should look at what happened to them. It's not only telling you to look at what happened to them, it also tells you what happened. It just creates that entire narrative. You don't have any point where you are going to think for yourself. And when that thought of yourself goes out of it does not come even in the picture, people then similarly, simply out of their ignorance and whatever it is, they believe what is on the screen. And one of the important points that Sanjay did make is that it just does away with a certain kind of political and ideological complicity which was there. People were complicit in what was happening from both the communities, from everybody who was a stakeholder in Kashmir. There was a certain level of political and ideological complicity which was there, which does not get mentioned anywhere in the movie or in any of the celluloid representations of Kashmir per se. And those depictions, those concocted depictions of both the communities, what they do is that they harm us more than they help us in any way. And engagement is absolutely very important, and which is why, Inder, I would like to ask you this question, that you being a Kashmiri Pandit, who I know has engaged with the Kashmiri Muslim community in one way or the other. There have been efforts on your part, and you have been part of initiatives where you've tried to have a dialogue with the other communities in the valley or outside of the valley, in Jammu and Kashmir as such. How do you see this depiction? Do you not see a point that when we are discussing Hindu killings, because now that we are taking these identities as it is, we're missing out the point that there were Muslim massacres as well? We're missing out the point where we do not understand, we do not discuss, or we do not want to use these words while we are discussing Kashmir per se. So how do you as a Kashmiri Pandit see these depictions at all? Inder. You're on mute, and we cannot hear you. Please unmute.
Thank you. I have myself, I changed my name in Inder Salim around in 1986 when I met our great comrade Abdul Sattar Ranjoor, and he sent me to Lucknow to attend this Golden Jubilee Progressive Writers Association was there in Lucknow. So since then, it's not something recently I have. So I don't know how it happened, but I have never found myself as a Kashmiri Pandit, or of course not of any. I have never fallen in this trap of identity thing. But at the same time, I am, of course, affected by the crisis. Of course, we can always go back to partition and how Britishers actually manipulated this entire belt and inserted. Even I'm sure in 1930s, Britishers did introduce the Jamaat Islami in Kashmir, definitely to subvert the Kashmir Manifesto. And we all know about that. And of course, they supported RSS and all those things. We all know about that anyway. So personally, I never found myself as a Kashmiri Pandit or Kashmiri Muslim. So I never present myself as a victim of these events in Kashmir, which of course, but it affected me. Of course, very close relatives got killed, but that never stopped me from going back and just engaging, art activities, whatever I could do at my own. Because of course, when you experiment with ideas, nobody comes forward because you are not working for some profit. So I always worked from my own pocket money to do whatever little I was doing. For example, I have worked Titwal Ka Kutta, one of my favorite stories about Kashmir. I think 5-6 different locations, different setups, different situations, places. And when this, I think it was 6th or 7th August 2019, when there was a huge protest at the Constitution Club. I think Sanjay was also there. I performed this Titwal Ka Kutta on the stage. What I did is actually I divided the audience into two parts, India and Pakistan. I just performed myself as a dog. In this story, this dog is basically labeled as a Pakistani spy, as a Junjun, and then the Indian spy as Shun. Then finally killed by both the armies in Titwal Ka Kutta. It is a reference to 1947 war. Right. So people instantly understand what is actually going on. The killing of the innocents. That's what happened in Kashmir all the time. So I really don't know how we actually engage this, how we restore these sensibilities on the lost, nuances in this black and white, churning of ideas, when we really want to understand what this film is doing, or what the narratives on the other side are actually doing. That's all the way we see it is happening. It is. I tell you, very 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 strange. I have arrived at this conclusion that, for example, we are living in a very, let us imagine Mona Lisa. We will not have Mona Lisa without the billions of digital prints around it. So there's a simultaneity of the original and the articulations and their interpretations around it. Similarly, when the film actually released this Kashmir file, I think, to my mind, all the articles and the reviews speak about this fact that it is a one-sided film. So once we are right now here in this room, we have this film and so many reviews, thousands of reviews and comments, and which are speaking about its one-sidedness. So what do we have? We have an alternative film which is actually, now we are looking at it without, which is actually without the lens, actually. The second version of it. Second version of is the other side of the movie. So the one-sided movie actually is actually unwittingly, it's actually making one more movie, which is this without the lens thing. So and of course the filmmaker, I was listening to his interview, he's actually conscious of this thing, that there will be criticism and there will be this other side will speak about it, and BJP is also prepared for that there will be a kind of a counter narrative for that. So every time we want to oppress the facts, something else erupts somewhere else. So this if you really go back into this 1990s thing, if for example, Sanjay's film talks about there were 35,000 armed rebels. So it was such an intense situation when things could have gone anywhere, and things were really unpredictable at that time. So what was going on there? Killings, of course, JKLF was on the lead, and the killings were happening, and of course, more Muslims got killed than the Hindus. We all know these things, but of course, we talk about only this minority killings. We don't talk about that's what the BJP is always doing it, and both the sides actually started doing it. So Farooq Abdullah and Congress, they will start inserting this Jagmohan narrative, and then things get it. Again, we crystallize in black and white. They say that they are not talking about my pain, and the other side is talking about, they don't talk about my pain. So in the process, again, the murder of innocents. That's what I'm saying. That Titwal Ka Kutta is one of the best actually stories on this partition, and of course it is set up in this Titwal region. Again, I will if I go. I was listening this. They communalized it. I have heard this. I have heard this many times. Many times, different narratives, essays, they communalize it. If we go, the Britishers, we say the Britishers communalized it. The Britishers, we say, no, it's the Muslim League which communalized it. They will say, okay, no, the Congress communalized it. And if we go to the 1990s, the people who on ground who were the spokesperson of it, they will say, okay, somebody else communalized it. Indian deep state communalized it. We never did it. We didn't want to communalize it. But on ground, we know that this, even Natasha Cole was saying in the Congress the same thing, that they communalized it. Of course, she was talking about this human rights violations, but this sentence is spontaneously coming out, they communalized it. So who is communalizing it? And what is it? It is, of course, the Tehreek was, of course, it had a direction. It was definitely not, concentrated on the removal of Kashmiri Pandits, but definitely it had a direction. It had a direction, and of course, the Nizam-e-Mustafa was the central slogan in it. And there are definitely anybody who would come in the way of that implementation of that thing would be removed. And of course, Muslims, Nancy workers, or who were moderates, and of course they were silenced. So there is this who communalized it. We have to go back into this earlier thing, starting from Britishers and coming down the film. So we have these counter narratives, and of course the falsification of it, of course the oppression of the facts. It is happening all the time, and what is actually the end result is that we have this innocent dog as a metaphoric dog who is killed innocently. The murder of innocence is basically the central essence of it. And what is the outcome of it? We really don't know what is this actualization of it. And I love this quote by Lacan. He says that the actual is the fruit on the tree called real, and the actualization bounces it back to chaos. So every time when we want to actualize the actual, it will be chaos.
Thank you, Inder.
Okay.
We have a comment from Sanjay about what you're saying. And also I have, in addition to that, also you could note one question of mine as well. When you talk about the efforts or initiatives that you've been doing, the things that come to mind is that who's been resisting you the most? Or when you say that, like the kind of efforts that you did, many people stop you or don't want you to do that. Is that like Kashmiri Muslims or Kashmiri Pandits who are doing it, or is it the state who is doing it? Other than what Sanjay would have to tell you. Sanjay, please come in with your comment.
I want to just kind of add a little bit to what Inder already said. When he said that he's been reading a lot of commentary around the film, which actually kind of reads through the film. And I have to say that I have been very, very surprised at the kind of writing that has appeared across the Indian media. Obviously not the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is now not worth engaging with. But a lot of commentary on this film, which has come from Indians who seem to have a pretty good understanding of what actually is going on, and what this film represents, what its challenges are, and so on. So I think if one is to find a slender thread of optimism, then I want to pick on what Inder said, and said that, yes, people are also, it's not that everybody in India who's watching this film is going to watch it in some comatose way, like some intravenous injection, and completely internalize it. People are making their own films in their heads and saying this is a bit too much, this is propagandist, it doesn't, seem. So there's that's a thing. The other comment I have to add at this point is about the film itself, which is that actually the film, when I keep saying that it's smarter than you think it is because it also folds in the criticism, So all the criticism about majoritarianism and so many of the other criticisms that are being levied at the film actually kind of, I won't use the word deals with it, but it kind of folds it into the narrative and kind of trashes it. So in that sense, it's a kind of really like a manifesto for people who want to believe a certain singular notion of what has happened in Kashmir, what happened in 1990, what happened in whatever, so that even the criticism is dealt with by the film. I'm not saying that they do it well, but what I'm saying is that they have anticipated the criticisms also, and which is why I give the film credit for that, or the people who are behind this film credit for that. So just these two small comments. Thank you.
So yeah, briefly in there, as I tried to ask you about your endeavors, like who's been stopping you when you say that your efforts and your initiatives, they are being stopped or resisted? Is it the Pandits or the Muslims or the state or somebody else?
Are you asking me the question?
Yeah, just a brief comment about like when you said that the efforts that you do, you face resistance, people try to stop you. Just trying to know who are the people who stop.
No, look, I know I push myself through particular ideas and then intensify it. For example, I did a one performance with nearly 500 children in Nagin Club. There were a lot of students there. They wanted to say, okay, do some performance. I said, okay, have you seen the black snow? Kuhun sheet, in Kashmiri we would say. So they say, no. I say, let me just show you how it is actually. So I got a barber and had a haircut, and I put on my lap a wet canvas with a Kashmiri landscape. And as he was actually trimming my hair, and the hair was falling on the wet canvas, which had an white pigment, landscape of Kashmir. And when at the end of this haircut, when the landscape was ready, so how the children would actually experience the Krunshi, how it's actually the black sun. So the question is that how, I love this idea of double burial in arts. What is double burial is that when you retrieve the bones of the dead and do some particular ritual, apply some pigment on the bones and then bury them again. There's a one specimen in Kashmir University, and there are many in Mexico also. So the double burial is a very, very interesting kind of term which we use in arts and theater to explain how we actually approach to the idea of arts. And that is how it is constantly happening. The question is what is your approach to the bones when you retrieve from the grave. That's actually the point. Everybody does it. So this film actually retrieves the bones and is doing some violence to the bones of their own dead. That's when you actually show the one-sided, is actually retrieving the half of the bones of the dead and do some quick ritual and bury them again. So this is what you have to actually understand this in a very profound manner. What is this double burial doing thing here? So we will have to go each and in future also, in past also, we are not free from this double burial system. Whenever we think again who we are, so we go back into our memory and bring it back and just interpret it and then bury it back again. That's what the constant process of it all the time. And there is no stoppage. Nobody actually nobody can force you down. I was actually, when Bindru and that sick lady and the other workers were killed, I was there, and then it was of course a panicky situation. And of course everybody, that's how the strange thing is there. Everybody on the ground was saying that it is the deep state working. We really don't know who is doing it. So all along what we have actually gained is this suspicion. We don't know. We clearly don't know. We can't identify anybody anymore, that who is the murderer, who is doing, and what is this interconnection between the people on the both sides. We really don't know. Things are very blurred. So in this situation, what can be, how can actually people retrieve or actually restore back their sensibilities? Maybe this film is actually an opportunity for the reconciliation in a larger sense. If I'm a little bit optimistic, rather than only going into this political trope. Okay, BJP is doing this for propaganda, and they're saying other side is actually talking about the Jagmohan narrative and all those things. I think the best moment. There will be more moments in future also. I'm always optimistic about it, that people will find the point to reconcile this difference. It is going to happen. Maybe I don't know in which way or whatever way, but people will find out, because I tell you very honestly, every Kashmiri Pandit and every Kashmiri Muslim family have sustained and retained their personal connections in Kashmir, and they come here. The people go there individually. Everybody has a friend in Kashmir. Everybody, irrespective of, maybe some exception is there.
Thank you so very much, Inder. It's a very good point to stop at. Realizing the fact that the way Kashmiri Muslims generally in this movie have been depicted as the devils and the demons, at least like you stating that the Pandits and the Muslims still have those kind of like cordial connections, or they still are apart, how they were earlier. This brings me to a very important question that I want to ask you, Anna. You as an academic who looks at or analyzes protracted conflict situations. When we talk about, because you mentioned the protracted conflict situation of Kashmir as well, when we talk about such situations, people sit at the intersection of identities generally, and in particular in these situations as well. And if we sort of like dissect this movie and analyze it, the kind of killings that have been shown, the identity that's highlighted in them, that flags in them, is the Hindu killing. Whereas like if we look at the kind of killings that happened in the 90s, there's no denial, because it was the full outburst of an armed resistance that happened that time, or call it the armed militancy as is referred. So the first Hindu killing that happened was of Tiklal Taplu. he represented BJP, but then there was another killing prior to him, which was of Muhammad Yusuf Halwai, who was an NC representative. So whilst Hindus were being killed, Muslims were also being killed. That means that, like, apart from religion, something else was under play, which is the political identities of how people were being linked or how people were being seen. Be it Lassa Kaul, who was a representative of Doordarshan or the radio, and the kind of programs that were happening and how it was being received by the opponents or the people who were against that, or the judge Ganju, who had actually pronounced the verdict of the killing. But at the same time, Maulana Masoodi, a very senior representative of the NC and who was in his 80s and nearly blinded. So do you think this representation of the Hindu only, like a person being killed just because he was a Hindu, not the intersection of for the political kind of leanings, do you think, like, given how the movie represents or what comes in the normal popular narratives also, that's a true representation of the realities? How do you look at it?
I think that's a very powerful question, Sif. I think what concerns me deeply is that if we back up for a moment, the use of propaganda, which is what you started us all thinking about, right? That's how you started us in the session. The use of propaganda is usually to evoke the past, to enact certain things in the present, right? There's a continuum being created between the past and the present to energize something. And I think the depiction that the film lays out, as you just described it, is violent. It's violent in that I'm just reminded, for example, of sort of the double, triple revisions of history that have been taking place. I think first there are the killings of Muslim bodies, tens of thousands of them, that have not been investigated. Those that lie in mass graves have often, for example, been already written up as foreign terrorists. And in our investigations, if you recall, in 2009, we could not look into most of the graves because we did not have the documentation. It wasn't made available to us. But a handful of those that were, 100% of the times they were written up as foreign terrorists, and 100% of the times we were able to find that they were not. They were civilians. They were ordinary Kashmiris. On occasion, they were perhaps Kashmiris who identified as militants at that time. So there's already sort of a revisioning and a violence that is done to memory in that step, right? Where you take an event and you reinterpret it and you consecrate it so deeply into the popular imaginary that questioning about it stops. And if people question it, whether it is through films and filmmakers like Sanjay, or whether it is, human rights defenders like my colleague Khurram Parvez, who is in the custody of the state today, if these people come forward and they seek to question it, they are then condemned for doing so. And this film coming out in this moment, because now the actions of the state solely target Kashmiri Muslims of every character, every stature of life, every avenue of life, they are being targeted, yes? And those that have been targeted, those that do not have representation, those that do not have a voice, those that can be held with impunity laws without charges being filed for a long, long time, those that have been disappeared in violation of habeas corpus, all of this repository is silenced because there's a larger narrative of terror, that the Muslim body consecrates terror on India, but not actually that majoritarian India has consecrated terror on the Muslim body. In that context, when this film surfaces and it proliferates the popular imaginary, there has to be a commitment to addressing history, to unpacking history, to giving credence to local knowledge and counter memory, through which I think the steps that my colleagues on the panel have proposed can actually be attempted. Because without that, you cannot simply go from what is circulating today between the film and the BJP. There's a lot in between, right? Between those two spectrums, what is there? the descent to this revisionism is very frail. And I think it has to be bolstered very particularly, with a lot of sort of deliberate intent, for the noise to die down and there to be a quiet where we can actually examine history and understand what it would mean to attempt atonement, to attempt healing, to attempt justice.
Thank you very much, Angana. And I think what you said is very valid in terms of how Kashmir is, and given that it's an ongoing conflict, and there's very less chances of how those who are not in Kashmir want us to see each other. And there is no platform as such to us, to Kashmiri Pandits or to Kashmiri Muslims, where we can actually speak to each other without, being told how we should speak to each other and how we should conduct ourselves around each other. And like you said, there is also sort of an intergenerational disconnect which has happened over the years, because there are people who have not lived there in the 90s, and then they get their understanding of that time through someone else telling them that this is how it is, and how that depiction and that representation, that misrepresentation gets played out on the screen, and how it then gets played out in the greater context of the politics that is there in India right now. And at the same time, what also happens is that the Muslim body is again at the center of the Indian politics. It has always been there, but given that the regime that is there in India right now, the Muslim body is being used over and over again to further the agenda of the government, or to give them a certain kind of acceptance within the masses. And for the masses as well, for themselves, there are certain things which they were not allowed to do or say in the public, because there were people who were always dissenting that, whether it was the Indian intellectuals or whether it was intellectuals from outside of India or intellectuals from Kashmir, from both of the communities. But now that there is a sort of a crackdown on that dissent as well, that somehow seems to have lost a voice. And I do agree with the point that the noise needs to die down before we can actually begin a reconciliation. We can get people to speak to each other, and more importantly, listen to each other. But at the same time, it's also very important that we acknowledge that in a protracted conflict, in a conflict like Kashmir, we have to work with what is given to us. It's very difficult for us to get into that ideal situation. It is always going to be precarious as long as something big does not happen. Now, what that big is, that's also a very contentious thing to say. So this just brings me to Sanjay. I would like to ask you this question, that we do understand that whatever is being done right now in India, anything that happens, especially when it is directed at the masses, there's an intention. Whether it's a movie, it's not just about Kashmir Files. We see how popular media in India has changed, particularly in the last 5 years. I want to ask you that now that we see that Kashmir Files there's an institutionalized backup to this film. Modi, Prime Minister of India himself said that if you are an Indian, you will have to watch this movie. So it's essentially making patriotism or nationalism conditional to you watching this particular representation or misrepresentation of what happened in Kashmir in the 90s. So you're giving that sanction, you're giving that backing to it, and then states making it tax-free, while there are movies made on similar subjects which are currently banned. So how do you see this institutionalized backing of this particular picture? And at the same time, how do you think how appropriate or inappropriate it is, given how the situation is currently in the Indian mainland for the minority as well as for the Kashmiri himself?
No, I think, as has been said from the beginning of this session, I don't think there is any doubt about the instrumental use of this film to push through the point of view of a majoritarian Hindu, state ideology. I think that we can let that rest over there. But I think that it's a very bleak time for a lot of people in India. And I'm not just talking about the Indian Muslim, but anybody who contests that majoritarian viewpoint is having a hard time. At the same time, we also know that what we are hearing and this echo chamber of the North Indian, what they call the Hindi belt, it sometimes makes you feel that, okay, this is the only way in which Indians are seeing Kashmir, but as we know that people in Punjab often have a very different reading of it, people in Tamil Nadu have a very different reading of it. people of Kerala might have a very different reading of it. So I think that just like a film like Kashmir Files tries to tell you how to think about Kashmir to Indians, I think that as Kashmiris, and as I speak to you as young Kashmiris, I think you must also resist the temptation of seeing what Kashmir Files is doing as being the only, as being how India is responding. See, one of the things that I often say that, I was almost, I don't know, 40 when I began to think of myself as a Kashmiri. So I have a kind of, I have a divided nation within me. But I find that I think it's, for young Kashmiris, it's also important to see who are your allies across the world, but even in India, And so at a time like this, I don't want to go on about it, but I really do feel quite, how should I say, I feel quite satisfied that, yeah, there are a lot of people who are seeing through this, who are calling it out for all the right reasons, not simply because they reject majoritarian politics, but even on fact, And so something has happened, and that, I think, tells us that what we do when we write, or we make a report, or we make a film, or we write a poem, or we do a performance, all of it matters, And we know that making that one film or one report or one poem or one whatever is not going to change the situation overnight. But at the same time, it allows conversations to take place. I mean, this panel of yours, I mean, why have you constituted this panel? Because these are people who have engaged with Kashmir in a way that you find rewarding, whether you agree with it or not, So I think in that sense, there is a lesson for all of us that we must engage even with the difficult other, and that does not mean that you have to engage with the right-wing goon who's coming to bash down your front door. But there is, after all, another world also out there, So I mean, I'm trying to find an optimistic place in which we can stand as we edge towards the end of this conversation. But I feel that while we, put up our defenses against this flow of propaganda that is being thrown at us, we must also look past it to see that where are the alliances, where is the understanding, where are people who really understand what it is that Kashmir is about, that it's not simply about the killing of Kashmiri Pandits, but it's a much, there is a political dimension to it, which is the elephant in the room, which a film like Kashmir Files simply refuses to give any place to.
Thank you, Inder. That was, thank you, Sanjay. I'm sorry.
Little bit, I will just come to this
sure.
wonderful,
Go ahead,
these ideas here, because of course, both Agadaji and Mr. Kakri are quite skilled in this political debates. I'm definitely a little bit way off, because my most of the time goes into this arts and abstractions, how it deals with it. I think so. Somehow I feel this somewhere it is lacking. This what you call crowd mandate. Crowds. So I was studying this crowd. Of course, this film is made for a crowd. So I'm always I really don't have this internal willingness to really understand the crowd and what it does, and of course it does strange, unpredictable things. But I will just go back into this this man-wolf hybrid thing. So the wolf always hunts in a pack. But if we have 10,000 wolves, then of course it's not the wolf pack. It is something very very difficult thing to understand. So we have this unpredictability in the crowd, and someone is there who is really misguiding it. It is happening always there. I think coming back quickly to the idea of Kashmir, I'm not so fascinated by these historical references, how we have to solve the Kashmir through history and all those things. And of course, these commissions for justice and all those things. I'm really not fascinated by these ideas. I want something new, something, it is actually the onus is on the Kashmiri intellectuals who are actually there. They should come up with some new document. This is my vision. This is my vision to understand how to deconstruct, let us say, capitalism, how to engage the environmental things. This is my idea of new psychology. This is about the women, because there was one of the question about the women, idea of women there. So we actually
that's
avoid this
actually
question.
in there. That's actually the question that I'm coming to right now.
I'm coming
you.
to that women idea.
Yeah.
One of the interesting takes on this new, what you call postmodernity, in my understanding. Of course, maybe I'm not so, kind of with some common sense, but of course I love this idea. This exception is the rule. What I'm thinking is that every becoming is becoming woman. I love this delusion phrase. Every becoming is becoming woman means that unless and until we don't really deconstruct this idea of masculinity somewhere, we will not be able to understand these histories and all those historical references. Of course, it's actually bores me to death, that we will have to solve the Kashmir problem. We have to go back to this, history and go back. I really don't know. Whoever is doing it, let them do it. But it doesn't suit me. I'm invested in the molecularity of the being, and I love that. That is how I flourish. Psychologically, mentally, aesthetically, whatever ways, and I'm content in that sense. So I don't feel this lack in the sense is that if I'm not counted somewhere in these political analysis of justice and all those things, it doesn't matter. The point is that what is my immediate pack? If we are four people and we are understanding these becoming and deconstruction of the masculinity, it is actually subception. So if we don't really deconstruct, I think the Kashmiri Sufism, most of the protagonists in all the poetry is basically female. If you really go all the poets through and through, you will never be able to identify the Kashmiri poet. You will see as if it was a woman talking about. So they have internally deconstructed this idea of the presentation of male, in their idea of love. It's very special thing. I cherish the idea of Sufism. It's very beautiful, actually, very unique in a sense. You have to, those who are in Kashmiri poetry, you will love it. So the question is that how we are actually representing the woman of course in this film, again, very obnoxiously, very dangerously, that on the body of the woman we are doing some politics which actually doesn't serve at all anything, because internally we have not deconstructed the male chauvinistic or patriarchy in our sense. So for me, it is actually the of course what the right wing is doing here, but that doesn't mean that they have to actually create the same toxicity while they're on the other side. Of course, there's a huge debate. Jinnah was right, something like that. It's always going on this thing, but it actually doesn't help nobody. I think Kashmir is a very fertile place, very uniquely situated in this geographical lockup. They can come up with some very special thing which can actually fascinate the entire world. Not this religious something. I really am bored with that. But not even this left thing idea. But tell me something about new, something which can actually attract the new imagination. Maybe
that's a very
years.
interesting point in there. I'm very sorry to stop you here, but actually we are running out of time, so we'll have to be as brief as possible. Anna, you wanted to say something? Please go ahead. Sure.
Very briefly, that as well, deconstruction, to attempt it, would require a structural analysis. And I think India's coloniality with respect to Kashmir has to be made front and center of that analytic. That's all. Thank you.
That's a very interesting point. And actually, what Inder was saying and what Sanjay said, the good takeaway message, like the positive fact that not everyone is actually receiving it the way that's being presented. But what's actually very important to note here is the larger organic ecosystem of the popular media, of what's being presented, and that's being shown as sort of the absolute truth, and the kind of power of that cultural hegemony that people are made to believe in that thing. The other thing also, like the reverse or the flip side of it, is like the kind of response that it's actually getting. Why? Because now the people, through popular media and other narratives, have been conditioned into such a mentality where they actually wanted to see such a thing. because it suits them how many people have been conditioned. Because the other day I was watching a video bite where an auto rickshaw driver somewhere in northern India was actually ferrying passengers free of cost, saying that it's a very important movie, I wouldn't charge you anything. So this becomes more of a service because they've been conditioned in such a way. So that's one thing to realize here, that no matter that there might be most certainly are people who have a contrary view of the things and who are trying to say other things. But then in this larger institutionalized din and chaos, that voice remains muted. That's one. The second very important thing, Sanjay, that you said was about engagement. But then at the end of the day, the engagement, like how, again, like what Angna says, the structuralness of that engagement, that number one, for this engagement, should the burden shift only to the Kashmiri Muslims who already are like under a lot of burden? That's one. Number second thing, how should this engagement be? Is there again going to be that elitist kind of power gradient where people are going to speak for Kashmiri Muslims rather than like staying by their side and speaking with them or helping or aiding or augmenting them to speak for themselves? So these are certain like analytical points which I think we need to engage upon. Now I'm coming to Inder, what he was talking about, like the molecularity of humans. But then we cannot ignore the fact that there are larger realities, the macro realities or the meta realities that are unfolding. For instance, like in the recent past, what we've seen, call it the lynchings and other things, but now the new thing that's in is the hijab. I was actually reading the news today where a girl who was trying to pray in her classroom in Bhopal, she was like actually reported, and it created a lot of ruckus. The point that I wanted to ask you, Inder, is that again about this movie, it's another form of patriarchal storytelling where people are made emotional. You know, they're made emotional by depicting how a Pandit woman body was attacked, how it was disrobed, and like how we need to be vengeful in order to like square those things. Yeah. So do you think that this in a way is normalizing the already prevalent and growing violence in India against Muslim women, especially Kashmiri Muslim women? Something of the sort that like इस औरत के अब कपड़े उतारो या इसका हिजाब उतारो क्योंकि कश्मीरी पंडित औरत के साथ भी यही हुआ था. Do you think this is setting a precedent, rather reinforcing and augmenting that mentality? Sorry, Inder, you'll have to unmute.
Okay. Sorry. I think this is, we have, there are many erasures. One can keep on counting the losses. I'm not only thinking about that what they do to the women. We always do. This is a special clever trick of this patriarchy. They show outwardly. This is like a preacherly thing. Preachers actually usually are trained into this skill, that they show what is the violence outwardly, but inwardly they actually practice it. They do it all the time. That's why we have this toxic patriarchy operating all the time, and we pay heavy costs for that. So I think people should actually realize that it is not working, and women definitely, if actually I'm damn sure, because my wife also talks to the women there, and they have a different special way of talking, and way of bonding is different than what the male talk to each other. I tell you, I have found the only beautiful people who really engage are those who talk in little bit in whisper, silently, little bit, not loudly, and they don't actually. My friend Noor Muhammad is there, wonderful. We actually never talk about politics. Whenever we meet, we talk about so many, because we have a huge friendship from our college time. I tell you, if you give me just 2 minutes, I will tell you a wonderful anecdote from my friend Noor Muhammad. Noor Muhammad was my college time. He had a stepmother, and she was actually not actually treated well during his college time. And those days, I gifted him a small painting there. I come from Bijbehara, right? So after all these migration and all those things, when I went to, he made a new house in Anantnag near his in-laws. And when I went into his new house, it was a really beautiful house, and I found no image on the walls. So I didn't question him right on the face that why there is no image in his room, one wonderful room. So I told him, have you actually left everything from this earlier ancestral home? He said, yes. I said to him, have you really not actually, kept a room there? He said, nothing. I gave everything to my stepbrothers. But only one thing he got from this ancient, earlier father's home from Bijbehara to Anantnag was only my painting. So all in his new house, all he has is my painting. Just one image in a new house, really, really beautiful house on the Pahalgam Road. And that's my gift. So these are smaller. That's what these molecularities are very, very important. One should actually count on them. I just believe that the molecularities have really tremendous power. So of course the violence and whatever is going on is of course there. I'm not there. Neither I can help myself or anybody there. What is going on. Recently there were killings of SPO and all this. There's a huge crowd actually wailing. I saw the video just today. So you are not there, but you cannot make an excuse for not investing your time into these molecularities. Actually one has to actually go back and just discover these nuances and these sensibilities for your own sake. This is what I'm saying just briefly, that I take molecularities very seriously. The powers embedded in the molecularities are very vast, very big. So please, this is my actually message to this my little entry into this wonderful room, that one should trust into this instant sensorial and the memory which we cherish all the time, because all my dreams are about Kashmir. All my dreams. I have lived here for 30 years, but whenever I dream, I am either in my school or in my some mohalla or gallery or whatever. So what is this? That means my initial years were so special to my becoming, that I keep on dreaming my poppy flowers behind the school and all those things. So definitely that must be very important to come back to your own things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hindal. And you did raise some of the valid points. And in line with the discussion we were having about how this is a very patriarchal way of telling a story, even if you are a very patriarchal representation of women in general, which is not something that Muslim women are new to, particularly how India is right now, how the environment in India is right now. And I think when it comes to a woman, she's always her body is always, there's a lot of politics that is done around a woman's body in any context. It will initially start with a minority, and then your identity gets piled on. And when you're a Kashmiri Muslim woman, that identity with itself brings along a lot of complexities. It puts your body on there's a lot of discussion around it. There's a lot of discussion of what can be done to you or what should be done to you. And many of the people like me, many of Kashmiri Muslim women like me who have lived in India for quite some time, they would have all sorts of experiences. If anything would happen in Kashmir, or if anything would happen in India, we would suddenly be in a very insecure mindset, or we would suddenly be at the receiving end of so many things. There's never that security, and that does come with our identity. And again, another point is that what gets discounted is that our interpersonal interactions with each other, they do not come out anywhere. It is very important that we do rely on those molecularities, but at the same time we do not discount. It's very important that our road to that molecularity or to those interpersonal interaction goes through the road of acknowledgements, and that acknowledgement cannot be one way. And that acknowledgement, when it comes to Kashmiri Muslims, and as well as to the fact that we are discussing women, would also mean that we do understand and acknowledge that what is happening currently as we are speaking to each other. We have seen instances of Muslim women being put on sale. We've seen instances of all sorts of dehumanization happening, particular to women. And that does leave you with a certain understanding that there is so much of work that needs to be done. A person can hide behind an identity and say all sorts of things to you. But when that person has to sort of come into a real interface with you, when you interact, when you develop that interpersonal interaction, obviously within the realms of your own safety, it does give you a certain better understanding and perspective. You humanize it. You humanize that person, that woman particularly. But this film, the celluloid representation, again feeds into that dehumanization and doubles the dehumanization on a Kashmiri Muslim woman and a Kashmiri first, because then that dehumanization is double layered on you. You're not just a Muslim woman, you're a Kashmiri Muslim woman. So if anything that was done to a Pandit woman, as has been shown in the film, if that happens to somebody on the streets of India right now, you would just have to say that she's a Kashmiri Muslim woman, and that is it. That will, it will make everything that's being done to you valid, and that could happen to you in broad daylight. So things like these, I think it's very important what you said. And this then brings me to Angna. Angna, a question that I would like to ask you now is that, shifting a little bit away from our discussion of Kashmir Files, we have seen that Kashmir Files, out of all the interviews I have heard of the filmmakers and those who are a part of the movie or the process of making this movie, they said that whatever money they had in the initial phases of the money, in the initial stages of the money, the scoping that they did was out of the money that was given by Pandit organizations in the diaspora. So the American Pandit organizations in the UK or in the Europe. So the initial scoping and whatever went into the movie was funded with them. Now, a very interesting point that comes out is that it is these same pundits who, in these host countries, in these Western countries, are outright supporters of the left. They do not support the right there because they do know that if they support the right there, it would not help them or benefit them in any way. But at the same time, they are avid supporters of the right back home, and they would do anything. They're funding it. So would you say that there is a disconnect between how we are seeing this? There's a disconnect. We are failing to acknowledge the role and a wider, sinister role that this diasporic community can play in anything malicious that can then be done to Kashmiri Muslims or Muslims in general. There's a disconnect. There's no conversation around this. That how is this diasporic population, which is outside of India and in the host countries, are claiming to have a certain identity or a certain orientation, but then at the same time they are funding projects like these. They can very well be doing, they can fund something far more sinister than a simple celluloid representation. So how do you see this?
I think Uru said this is a very important point. I think a few things. One is that the support of the diasporic Indo-American community or even the Pandit community, who they support, has also changed over time. And I think we need a new assessment of that. And it is not only any longer left, but there is support of sort of I don't know in particular to the Pandit community, so I'm talking about the Indo-American community in general. And I think it now is across the spectrum, left to right. And I think also the consolidation of the Hindu right post the pogrom of 2002 in Gujarat, from then on through Modi's, barring of entry to the United States to the present, the trajectory of the Hindu right in the United States has grown stronger and stronger. And today they represent quite a formidable body with access and reach to politicians, with the capacity to also be influential. And their nexus with Silicon Valley aspects or fragments of Silicon Valley position them very well to do so. So I think that it is also how they invest their money is also strategic. That because if I can speak again, I don't know about the Pandit organization in particular that may have funded this film, so I'm speaking about the Indo-Americans in the United States. I think funding is given for all sorts of reasons. And over the years, it adds up to millions of dollars. And they fund sort of Hindu right organizations or entities on the ground in India. They fund representations of India in the United States to popularize and give currency to Hinduized India, to majoritarian India, to Hindu nationalist India, to also hook into the Islamophobia present in the United States and to galvanize that against sort of Muslim advocacy on behalf of Muslim communities that are suffering, or with respect to Kashmir as well. As you noted that, in 2019, there was a hearing on Kashmir, but following the hearing, not much has taken place. There were campaign promises that were made, for example, by both Biden and Ms. Harris. However, post the elections, not much actually has happened with respect to Kashmir, right? So I think that the diaspora communities that are of the Hindu right are extremely strong and well positioned to intervene on various footing. So just because they are at the moment focusing on funding a film does not mean that they're also not funding a series of other investments into actions, popularizations, representations of the Hindu right and its legitimacy in the United States and also back home in India.
Thank you, Anna. That's a very, what do I say? Like sort of a very somber kind of aspect that gets highlighted. I mean, like the time it finally or fully blooms and manifests in India, and the kind of connections it has outside. It like it might have very more negative and violent connotations. Coming to the movie per se, Sanjay, if we talk about Bollywood, especially after the late 1980s or the eruption or inception of the armed militancy of late 1980s, the kind of like representation of the Kashmiri Muslims that has been done by the Bollywood has sort of like inherent dehumanization, if I may call so, for the lack of a proper word. And but then there is also something which is really important to understand here from the perspective of this movie is that the kind of transformations in that representation that are taking place. Earlier, like when you'd show a Muslim, Kashmiri Muslim, he would be shown as Gumrah, or who's been misled or led astray by some external agent, and then they are made to believe in a particular thing, and then they are led astray. So they are not evil actually, but they are made evil. All right, they are conditioned into a certain kind of mentality. But now with this movie, what's happening is that it's representing Kashmiri Muslims as primordially or inherently evil, who are like born or basic ingredient of them is to like hurt Hindus or like devastate them or kill them or do whatever. Second is the conversion of this private into public, or the fusion of these two categories. Earlier, like the kind of this Islamophobia, as Anna mentioned, or the kind of sinister designs, they would be kind of private. For instance, like the private video of that consul general in USA that got viral, where they were saying that we are going to replicate an Israeli kind of a design or a plan in Kashmir. That was something private which wouldn't be said in the public. But now what's happening is that, like, after we see in response to the movie, there are public statements. That means this division between the private and the public is fusing. It's just one. Now the people are outrightly saying that marry their women, kill them, we have to reclaim it, as Anna said earlier. How do you see these transformations from your perspective?
Thank you, Tosif, because actually this is something which must be noted. This transformation, so it's not as if, unlike what is being said by the makers of this film, it's not as if Bollywood was ever sympathetic to what's happening in Kashmir, or was pro Azadi, or none of those things, which they now seem to claim that it was, because they want to set themselves up as different. And I once made a sort of series of one-line synopses of many of the films, and you're absolutely right. The Kashmiri was always Gumrah. He was either, a young child who would throw grenades because he loved his donkey, or it was a girl who was deaf and dumb, or they were always in some way or the other people who were being exploited, misused, and obviously misused by, and the implication was always that it was Pakistan. And you're absolutely right. Here there's a complete transformation. Of course, Pakistan is somewhere in the horizon, but there is a depravity and a kind of toxicity to the representation of the militant figure, which is a significant shift, And I think that connects to the point that I made very early in our conversation today, which is to say that because a very different claim is being laid. Now it's not about whether Kashmir is going to be part of India or not, or whether Hindus and Muslims should live together, but that Kashmir is that sacred space. That's the representation in this film, and it's articulated in these ways. It's the sacred space that wherein resides the soul of India. So if you want to save India, you have to sort it out. You have to, and what does that sort out means? That you need to sort of almost, it goes beyond whether they're Kashmiri Muslims or Kashmiri Pandits, actually, in some senses. So that part of the message is quite dire and very. That's what I said right at the beginning, that I don't think we should dismiss this film at all lightly, because I think it has a very deep kick in it. Now, all I want to say is that yes, it's a message that is tailor made for a certain kind of audience, and I hope for all our sakes that um, it's not a universal state of mind. That there is space in which we can have conversations with people where the complexity of what we all believe in and our understanding of Kashmir's history, its past, all of that can be brought to bear and kind of rescue this. See, what they're trying to do is just snatch the narrative and cast it in stone. And I think we know that it's very important not to allow that to happen. That is what has been going on for the last 15, 20 years, even longer, that people have chipped away at that attempt to lock the narrative in a certain way. And I think all of us will continue to do that, irrespective of what else goes on around us. We will continue to chip away at that attempt to lock this as the narrative of Kashmir.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. And I think the last point that you made, that it's very important that we do understand that we are always going to be faced with these toxic representations of whether it's a population or whether it's the people that we're talking about in general, whether it's the Kashmiri Muslim, or what happened and how it happened, what was the chain of events, or what caused what. So there's always going to be a variation of opinions and as well as variation of depictions, which just makes it as complex as it anyhow is. So we do understand it's a very, very important topic, but we have a limited amount of time. So now I would be really asking for your concluding remarks. And in that, I would like to start with you. In that, we do understand, and I think one of the things that all of us would agree with is that it is a representation which has been made with a certain intent. There's an intent behind this particular representation. And what this, I would like to ask you is that, do we then say that what has been shown with the intention of discounting the tragedies of the Kashmiri Muslims? There has been a very intentful quantification that has been done to represent, because whatever otherwise intellectuals or scholars would say based on the research work that they would have done would then say that probably it is the Kashmiri Muslims, just like Angana said, it is the Kashmiri Muslims who have then suffered more if we go down on quantifying it than the Kashmiri Pandits would or ever would have been subjected to. But then this quantification as well, this misrepresentation of that also, would then it mean that it has been done with the intention of discounting the tragedies of the Kashmiri Muslims, the massacres and everything that has been done there in their context. And at that same time, while doing that, what you're doing is that you're further alienating the two communities. So what would you have to say about that?
Okay, number one, I
would just request you to be very brief. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah. I will go back to this Titwal ka kutta. That's what the murder of the innocents. The second thing is that Pandit intellectuals who have this potential and capacity to make films and write books and all that, they should also talk about the Kunun Poshpora thing. And I hope that the Jagmohan narrative is also suspended definitively, because it's actually this again and again coming up, who communalized it. That's actually a very unfortunate thing which is coming up all the time, because it's actually exonerates the culpability of this what has happened in 1990, because maybe the Indian deep state was actually working very hard on it. So that actually creates this impossibility of reconciliation. I think both of them should actually work towards it. That's what I don't like these commissions, although they should instantly talk about this. There's a huge social media and all those things are happening, and accept that sorry, or feel the losses. And I think I'm really telling you very honestly, many I have many friends in Kashmir, they all say that it was terrible thing in 1990, and this Jagmohan thing and all those things is really unfortunate, which is actually coming up, and is actually undermining the pain of the Pandits. That's what I'm saying on the ground reality. Right. Facts are facts. Forget about that. And the Pandits also should come out very, very boldly that yes, that the Indian forces have done terrible things there, whether not only rapes and all those things and massacres and all those things. This courage. One, we should have the courage as Kashmiris to really come up and face the facts, and just for the sake of living. Politics is somewhere else, and there will be always these politicians who have their own axe to grind, and I cannot actually invest my time in that thing. I think I trust the molecularity, I trust this courage thing. If people don't have the courage to speak the truth, I don't think then we are basically again going back this patriarchal thing, and we have this huge amount of bigotry and hypocrisy. We all the time exercise it. We know it's not that I'm also from the same milieu. It's not that something I don't know what we are doing. We are doing all the time. We actually hurt ourselves in the process, and we become lonely in the end. So to really live a very good life and very positive life, it is important to be courageous rather than just hide behind these nonsensical narratives which have been supplied to each of us on the both sides of the border. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inder. Amna, you wanted to say something?
Yes, very briefly. I wanted to say that to challenge representations that are unjust and untrue, and here, given that we've spoken of the film at length, I just wanted to posit a couple of thoughts briefly. One is that communalism does not, unfortunately, take into account disparities in power, structural power particularly. And I think in depicting the Kashmiri Muslim, there has been a deliberate racialization driven by xenophobia and Islamophobia on part of the Indian state and those that have supported such intent. I think toward the end of our conversation, and thank you so much for making this possible, I'm grateful for it, one must turn to hope. And I think hope in affective solidarities. I think that it is important, of course, that Kashmiri Muslims reach out and find solidarity, but I think rather the burden should be on those in India to reach out to Kashmiris, to say that we wish to offer solidarity, and we wish to do so being mindful of your needs, your struggle, and that you need to drive with consent what comes of your future. So I think the burden is on us. I speak as a citizen of India. I think internationalism, there is hope for me in that, even though the US government, for example, has not taken steps that one would have hoped because it relies on its relationship to India. But there is still, even in international governments and the United Nations, acknowledgement of India's illiberal turn at the highest levels, which is very, very important. And I think as well as coverage in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, etc., have gone up. And they've actually depicted what is going on in India and also in Kashmir with great deliberation. So those are spaces of hope. And I think to accumulate them, to build on them, to create from one small pocket of hope, to have it proliferate is the challenge and is also a call for us, to us. Thank you.
Totally, Agna. Thank you so very much. That's a very wonderful note to end on. So we sow the seeds of hope and hope for them to actually flourish and bloom. So that's the note. I wouldn't add anything further on to that. I thank our audience. I thank our guests for their time today. I hope you liked. Inshallah, next week we'll come with another live session on any other significant issue of our society, of our people, of our land. Till then, thank you so very much. Goodbye. Assalamu alaikum.